Okay, students, so we have been talking in the past couple lectures about the action potential, the electrical impulse that's transmitted down the length of an axon in the neuron. And we've talked about how that action potential, what creates the action potential is the flipping of charges. So at rest, a neuron is electrically charged with a lot of sodium outside of the neuron and then a lot of potassium inside the neuron. And that difference in the sodium-potassium concentrations from outside to inside the neuron creates a difference in the electrical charges so that the outside is primarily positive, the inside is negative. And then if we create the action potential, all we have to do is flip the charges. And if we flip the charges back and forth, then when we create these changes in the voltage, that will be the action potential. That's the electrical impulse. And that action potential, that electrical impulse, will then be traveling down the axon of the neuron. So what we want to look at now is how do we create that? How do we create that flipping of charges? Now, one point I want to make out here is that these action potentials, they occur in neurons. They also occur in muscle cells. Both neurons and muscles have this common property of excitability. And earlier on, we talked in the muscle cells about how that action potential would travel down the T-tubules, for example. Well, in this case, the action potential we're dealing with the neurons, the action potential is going to travel down the axon of a neuron. So again, an action potential is this brief switching, this brief reversal of voltage back and forth, and that creates this, that is the electrical impulse. Once an action potential is created, and action potentials are always exactly the same size. That's part of that all or none response. You either get an action potential or you don't, and once you create an action potential, it's always the exact same size. The action potential will always travel all the way down the axon, and the molecular basis for this action potential, what creates that flipping of charges, is the opening and closing of voltage-regulated sodium and potassium gates. So we're going to get into that molecular picture, but first let's just review the different parts of the action potential, the different parts of the electrical impulse. Here, point number one, here's at the resting state, the membranes at rest, the resting membrane potential minus 70. Here we have the flipping upward of the voltage. This would be the initial flipping of the charges. And that side of the action potential is called the depolarization side. It's called depolarization. And then when the charges flip back to normal, that voltage drops back down. That is called repolarization. And then finally, it turns out with the action potential, when those charges flip back down, there are actually extra charges, extra positive charges that actually leave. And that creates what is called this hyperpolarization state. So the electrical charge of that membrane of that neuron in that area right following the action potential is hyperpolarized. It's a little extra negative, and then slowly it will come back to rest. Notice right here I've indicated a threshold voltage, and what we will find is this goes all the way back to the overview. We have to, for an action potential to be created in the axon of a neuron, we have to raise the voltage up to a threshold voltage. Once we reach threshold voltage, then we will create the action potential. So let's look at the molecular basis of this. It starts off, here we start off at rest. And at rest, we have a leaky sodium and leaky potassium channels. Potassium is leaking out, lots of potassium is leaking out very fast, whereas only a little bit of sodium is leaking in. And we create this resting level. Now notice here, at this point right here, we're beginning to look now at the sodium and potassium gates. And here is a sodium gate, and here is a potassium gate. And at rest, both of those gates are closed. And it will just be leaky channels that are constantly open, that will be creating the resting membrane potential. Then for depolarization, at depolarization what happens is the sodium gate opens and sodium rushes into the cell. And when all those positive charges rush into the cell, that creates a flipping of the charges, and that creates this depolarization state. We're creating this upward movement in voltage. Now at the very top of the action potential, the sodium gates close and the potassium gates open, and potassium rushes out. And as potassium rushes out, all of its positive charges that it carries rushing out of the cell, that will cause the interior of the cell to become more negative, back down towards its original resting state, and that's called the repolarization state. It's called the repolarization side of the action potential. And then finally, the potassium gates, the potassium gates will open a little bit longer, and that causes extra potassium to rush out, and it's this extra potassium rushing out that causes this hyperpolarization state, where the membrane potential is a little bit more negative than at rest. And so again, you have the resting state, the depolarization state, the repolarization state, and hyperpolarization state of that electrical impulse, the action potential, and that is again related to the opening and closing of gates. During depolarization, it's sodium gates opening, sodium rushes in, that causes those charges to flip, because all these positive charges associated with sodium are rushing in. On the repolarization side, the sodium gates are closed, the potassium gates are open, all the potassium rushing out and its associated positive charges cause the interior cell to become more negative. And finally, at hyperpolarization, we have extra potassium rushing out, and that causes the hyperpolarization state. And so if we look at these again, at the resting state, we have leakage channels. The leakage channels are open. That's allowing the initial resting membrane potential of -70 to be created. And at the resting state, all the potassium and sodium gates are closed. And the depolarization state, the voltage-gated sodium channels open. Sodium rushes in, and that causes depolarization. That causes the upward rise in the voltage of the action potential. And the repolarization phase, in this case, we have the sodium channels closed. The voltage-sensitive potassium gates are open. Potassium exits the cell. That causes the downward side of the action potential. And then finally, we have the hyperpolarization state, where the potassium gates stay open a little extra long, and allowing extra potassium to move out, and that causes that membrane potential to become hyperpolarized. It becomes a little more negative. And eventually, that will return to rest. Eventually, the potassium gates will close, and everything will come back to the resting membrane potential. Thank you.